Could I get the slides, please? Is that possible?
Yeah. Yes.
Would be a good start? Okay, very good. So what I'm actually going to talk about is the Nobel Laureates campaign and touch on a few points that I normally touch on when I give talks in this area. And I will skip through some slides if I feel that they've already been dealt with during the session. So So this is the reason that I started the campaign. I got invited to Mark Van Montague's 80th birthday party. And I spent the day listening to people talk about plants, and in particular, I listened to people talking about the difficulties that they faced as a result of opposition from the Green parties in almost everything they did. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing, to be honest. I'd read about it a little bit, but I just couldn't believe how bad things were. The next day, I'd been invited to talk to the European Commission about the future of medicine. Not that I claim to know much about it, but I decided to change the topic of my talk the night before and talk actually about medicine for developing countries and point out that in addition to needing all of the things that we think of, like vaccines and drugs and basic care and so on, the thing that they most cared about in many countries was food. People who go to bed hungry at night and don't really worry so much about medicine, but they do worry about food and whether they're going to have a good meal inside them. And of course, food means agriculture. And so for the last 10, 12,000 years, since agriculture first got going in the Middle East, things were pretty crude. People went out and gathered the plants they could and put them in the backyard and hoped they would grow. And then they started to figure out how to cross them and to make better breeds and so on. But in the 1980s, thanks to Mark and Jeff and Mary Dale Chilton, it suddenly became possible to manipulate these plants and to do breeding in a way which was just far more precise and far simpler than had been available previously. So what I decided that I would do after that talk was to maybe try and mobilize the Nobel Laureates if I could, because the Nobel Laureates, there was no one, not a single Nobel laureate who was a professional plant scientist. There were a couple who had distant connections to industry, but all of the people who'd previously been talking about plants all had connections to industry, for mainly, very often because governments wouldn't support them. The government support for plant research has been pretty pathetic, but of course the big agribusinesses, they've been interested in supporting them. And of course, as soon as you get money from business, along comes Greenpeace and the Green parties and say, well, we can't believe anything you say because you're tainted by industry. And then in the US in particular, they've had these Freedom of Information Act in which people come along and say, we want to see all your emails and you have to make all this available. And they've been harassed in ways that I think most of us can't even imagine who are not in the field. But you ask anybody in the field and they will tell you exactly what's going on. So it was really after Mark's birthday party that I started to think about this, but it really wasn't until 2015 when I decided to get going and really start to recruit Nobel laureates if I could. I had some ideas of what I thought a campaign might look like, and so this is when it got started. I went to the Lindau meeting in southern Germany where there are a lot of laureates. With, I think, one exception, every laureate who was at that meeting said, this is a great idea, we'd like to join you. And I think I launched maybe, 20 signatures just at that one meeting. And then I started to send out requests to other people, and eventually, by the time that I'd finished collecting signatures, and by the time that I had what I thought was a respectable number of Nobel laureates, which at the time I thought was 100, was what I was shooting for. This was a time to launch. And so we did a press conference down in Washington. This was June 30th of this year. Down at the Pet Press Club in Washington, we got a bunch of publicity. There was something like 25,000 blogs went out, or news articles that went out immediately following the news conference. And the idea was that here we were a group of people that in general, a lot of people, including the general public, listen to. They take us seriously, and we thought we were pretty immune from attack by Greenpeace because we didn't have any connections with industry. There was just no one who signed the letter with any connections to agribusiness. And basically what I did was to send out a fax to the Green parties, to every UN ambassador, calling on them to stop scaring the public by pretending that GMO foods were dangerous. This was it. Stop making all of these misleading statements. You know, after 20-odd years of use of GMO products in the field, and not a single case of an accident, not one in which there's been any problem, the time had come for Greenpeace and the Green parties to admit they just got it wrong. This was an issue that maybe at the time they could argue they were right to do it, but by now there was just no excuse for it. They were simply wrong. And this was the cartoon that I used to sort of illustrate it. It's by a man called Brian Duffy. He's out in Iowa, and it's rather good. On the left is essentially Greenpeace, who are saying, you know, do you know what this stuff, these GMOs can do to you? They're really dangerous, frankenfoods and all the rest of it. And the little boy on the right is saying, yes, I know, these things can help keep me alive. And I think it's very difficult to look at that and not feel that, you know, here is something, here is a technology which can help the developing world in major ways. Why would anybody be against it? If we think about what's happened in agriculture, basically what has happened is that over the years we've gone from this very thin, stringy thing called teosinte on the extreme left to what now looks like a good, healthy piece of corn, a good cob of corn, maize. On the right is a cartoon I love from the New Yorker, which shows a very happy big corn cob, and the lady is wondering which one is the genetically modified corn. Well, I think it's not difficult to figure out which that should be. Now, what I've tried to do when I give talks in this area is to try to find analogies that will go to the common person, that will go to people who really don't know very much about genetics and about what goes on. And so I use the approach of saying between traditional methods of doing things, of making plants, where you kind of take two genes and mix them up, much the way you make babies. The two people get together and they produce an embryo, and that embryo is a mix of the genes in the two people. And so the question is, I want to move a GPS system from one car to another. What do? Do I take the cars apart and then put everything back together and hope I'm going to get something that works? Or do I just take the GPS from one car and move it into the other? And the precision methods now of plant breeding look much more like taking a GPS from one car and moving it into another. And I always then ask, well, you know, Greenpeace would have you believe that if I took the GPS system from an airplane and put it in the car, now it's going to fly. And, you know, it is just nonsense. It is all of this misleading stuff that they're putting out. And they were very successful. They've been very successful at scaring the public. And the problem is, once people get scared, it is very, very difficult to reassure them. And this is really all about emotion. It is not about science. We've heard this before. The science is clear. The science is safe. The science says everything is good. And it's all about how we deal with these emotional issues. And of course, we always feel as scientists that all we've got to do is explain the science to everybody and they'll understand it. And unfortunately, it's not true. That doesn't often work. And so the other thing I like to do, if I can get this, yes, so is to point out that what is important is the product, you know. GM, genetic modification, it refers to a method. It's a way of doing something. We've been genetically manipulating plants since forever. But now we've learned how to do it in a much more precise way. And what's important is the product. And this is also true for traditional breeding, and I think it's important we remember that. And again, I like the analogy. Here's a production line, okay? So we're making a means of transportation. So what are we making? Well, it could be a car, it could be a tank. The product is what matters here, not the way in which we made it. I think we can all agree that, you know, if you want to be driving down the highway, you'd prefer the car rather than the tank. This is an example of traditional breeding and the product of traditional breeding. And that is, if you look in almost any plant that is out there, you find a lot of pesticides. And here are some that have particularly large quantities of natural carcinogens. Celery is a good example. If you cut up celery, you get celery juice on your hands. The ladies who used to work with celery juice had problems because they would get a dermatitis that in some cases would turn into skin cancer. And this is because carcinogens that are in celery. But we all eat celery. It's perfectly okay. The quantities are very small. If your entire diet was celery, you'd be in trouble. But it's not. Our bodies know how to deal with these things. And so what's important is what is in there and what are the quantities. And this is an example of something that any organic farmer or any member of Greenpeace would tell you, perfectly safe, you don't have to worry about this. No carcinogens here, it's natural, and so it must be okay. And this is just wrong-headed thinking. And I'm inclined to think that if we're going to do something about regulating foods, we've got to look at the products. Okay, forget about the methods. The methods don't matter. So you might ask, well, why didn't Europe sort of get behind this? Okay, it turns out that in the developing world, there really is a need for crops with higher yields. In Europe, we don't need, and in the US, we don't need GMOs. We have plenty of food. You don't see a lot of thin Europeans walking around unless they've just emigrated in from Africa. And so why doesn't Europe endorse GMOs? You know, it makes no difference to them. And so I ask, is it politics, is it money, or is it both? And I think the answer is that it's both. And the real problem was that the Europeans didn't want US companies to control their food. And so how can we prevent that? How are we going to stop that? Well, of course, the easy thing to do would be to ban Monsanto. We'd say we're not going to buy anything from Monsanto. But there's a problem. In Europe, an awful lot of the seeds are bought from Monsanto and produced by traditional breeding. And so if we say we're not going to buy them anymore, then we will start to see some thin Europeans. So they couldn't take that tack. And so what did they do? They said, well, precision agriculture or GMOs must be dangerous. And you could make stories up. It was very easy, you know. Take genes from a salmon and put them into a plant. Maybe the plant's going to swim at the end of it. It's just crazy, the stories that they came up with in order to scare people. And of course, they had very good advertising agency working for them. And I think you know as well as I do that a good advertising firm can sell you pretty much anything. I don't think there is anything that they cannot tell you. And when we try to defend ourselves from this, we don't stand a chance because we don't have the money to pay for the same sort of advertising. And so Greenpeace were incredibly successful. And the beauty of this is by saying, well, here's something dangerous. So what do politicians do? They say, oh, I will protect you from the danger. Vote for me. I will protect you. And in this way, Greenpeace gained both political power and they also gained money. They're one of the NGOs with an annual budget of about $500 million a year. And the reason they've been so successful at raising money is because of this. And the best of all of this had no economic consequences for Europe. Europe didn't need GMOs, so it was just fine, no problems. But of course, the tragic consequences is they took it abroad. And so they can't say, oh, these things are perfectly fine for the developing countries, they're just dangerous in Europe. And so now they're going around telling the developing countries they're dangerous there too. And this is getting to a point where it's just ridiculous and we have to stop it. We've got to find a way to stop it. All of the major professional societies have come out and said that GMOs are perfectly safe. The only people who are negative are the people who are anti-GMO to start with. And in general, they have no professional scientists associated with them. Let me skip through this because we probably heard enough about golden rice. My feeling on this and what the sentiment that was expressed in the letter that we sent to Greenpeace and that we sent to the UN ambassadors was, you know, just how many people, how many kids have to die before we consider this a crime against humanity. I think we've gone way past that point. I think what they're doing is criminal and they have to be stopped. There are several projects that we're trying to get underway. One is bananas in Uganda. Bananas have a particularly interesting problem. They're very difficult to deal with. They have a disease called Xanthomonas wilt. There is no non-GMO solution. There's no way of fixing this by traditional breeding. but there's a beautiful GMO solution to this. Sweet pepper is resistant. There are 2 genes. We know how to do that. They've been put into bananas, and bananas look to be safe. This is perfect because 30% of the calories in Uganda come from bananas, and in many other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, this is also a very important food crop. Hawaiian papayas are already a GM food, but in Hawaii, when the politicians want to label everything, they wanted to say all the foods had to be labeled if they had GMO constituents. The farmers were up in arms. They said, no, 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 you can't do that. And so what did the politicians do? They said, oh, we will grandfather papayas and we'll pretend they're not GMOs, and it's only the others that have to be labeled. So GMO papaya ended up saving the Hawaiian crop. 77% of everything that we eat in the US that is a papaya is GMO. In Thailand, the solution is banned, and so what have they been doing in Thailand? The papaya farmers have been getting it on the black market from Hawaii, and they've been growing these GM papayas in Thailand now to overcome the papaya, the virus that is causing all the problems there. So I think one of the things we have to do is to realize that, you know, if you don't want to eat foods that are derived by GM methods, well, that's your choice, but recognize it's a choice. Don't pretend that they're dangerous, because if anything, they're probably safer than traditional foods. You know, traditional foods are never tested for all of the things that one has to test for if you're looking at GM foods. For developed countries, food isn't a problem, but when we do things here, we must remember that whatever we do and say here has consequences around the world. We can't pretend it's just for us, and we need to make sure there's a hell of a lot more science in politics, and ideally less politics in science. Politicians should listen to the scientists they fund. If they're not going to listen to us, why do they fund us to do the research? Okay? They should listen to what comes out. Stop supporting foods that are stop pretending they're dangerous. And finally, I don't know if any of you have seen this paragraph 72 from the EU report, urging G8 member states not to support GMO crops in Africa. There is a crime right there to try to get such an article into the European Constitution. And I think civil society has to play its role too, and I think it's important that the major religious leaders should speak out, and this is why I'm still optimistic that at some point it will be possible to talk directly to Pope Francis and to persuade him that he should say something very positive here. I talked earlier in this year to the leader of the Chinese Buddhists at a big convention in China. The Buddhists are 100% behind GMOs. I'm just trying to figure out how to get them to make a statement. But I think there are many religions, and they should come out. These are people who, in principle, support the poor. They want the poor to do well, and they should do everything they possibly can to make sure they live healthy lives. The Rotary clubs are interesting. I've spoken to a couple of Rotary clubs now, and they are very interested in this, and they're thinking that they may put this onto the agenda of the Rotary clubs. That would be huge, because Rotary clubs are around the world, and they specialize in trying to help the poor. Influential celebrities, it would be good if they would speak out. We certainly need to make sure that the media do a hell of a lot better job than they did with this article in the New York Times, which was appalling. I actually wrote to the editors of the New York Times and suggested that they might want to meet with some of the laureates and myself, who are based down in New York, and discuss this, because I think what they did was just almost criminal. It was terrible, that article. It was just not true, most of what was in it. And finally, I think we have to make sure that knowledgeable scientists do not get silenced. The people who really know this area are the plant scientists. Many of them are quite articulate. They're good at explaining what's going on. I think we have to help them when they get attacked by Greenpeace. And my hope was that many of them would join the Nobel campaign, and that they would feel we could provide them with some protection. And finally, this is my message to Greenpeace. It says, have a heart. You know, non-GMO is a Western indulgence of the rich. If you see this little boy on the left, he's got plenty of food, and on the right, they don't. And non-GMO just doesn't work for the poor in Africa. I thank you.